Hello friends, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about what it was really like to live in the Wild West. So grab yourself a root beer float or an iced tea. Pull up a chair and let's talk about the Wild West. When most people think of the Wild West, they picture cowboys herding cattle across the plains, maybe a shootout at high noon. But what was daily life actually like for the average person living out west during this time period? Getting supplies was harder when you were isolated from most stores. The nearest neighbor might be miles away, so you couldn't just drop by for help. Everyone was in the same boat, struggling to make a life in a harsh environment. We typically think of them as places where men go to drink alcohol and cause trouble. They were the gathering place for travelers and traders who brought news of the outside world. People would come to the saloon to catch up on current events and to learn about new opportunities or dangers that lay ahead. Saloons were also a place where business deals were made and friendships were forged. Well, the answer might surprise you. Contrary to popular belief, coffee was actually the most popular drink in saloons. That's right. But what you probably don't imagine is that the average person weighed about 120 pounds. The food was also different. People ate a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, and they didn't have access to processed foods or sugary drinks. Everything from the food to the clothing to the work was very different from today. It's hard for us to imagine what life was like in the Wild West, but hopefully this video has given you a little insight. This meant that their diets were naturally lower in calories, and they didn't have the same weight problems we have today. And as always, thank you for watching. Of course, this doesn't mean that everyone in the Wild West was thin and fit. There were plenty of people who were overweight or obese. But compared to today, the general population was much lighter. That's right. The average person in the Wild West was significantly lighter than we are today. The reason for this is pretty simple. People were just more active back then. They walked everywhere, rode horses, and did a lot of manual labor. This constant physical activity meant that people were constantly burning calories, and they didn't have the chance to gain weight. The rugged cowboys of the Wild West were fueled by caffeine, just like the rest of us. Of course, there were plenty of saloons that sold beer and whiskey, but coffee was by far the most popular drink. It was cheap, easy to make, and it gave cowboys the energy they needed to keep working long after the sun had set. In fact, coffee was so important to cowboys that they often brewed it over their campfire while on the road. They would start their day with a cup of coffee, and they would end their day with another cup of coffee. Coffee was more than just a drink for cowboys. It was a way of life. It gave them the strength and stamina to endure the long, hard days on the trail. And it was a welcome source of comfort in an otherwise harsh and unforgiving environment. Many important deals were made over a game of pool or a bottle of whiskey, and many friendships were forged in the heat of a poker game. The saloon was a place where men could let their hair down and be themselves. It was a place where they could forget their worries and enjoy a cold drink in good company. Of course, things didn't always go smoothly in saloons. Fights and gunfights were not uncommon, but that was part of life in the Wild West. And that was certainly true sometimes. But saloons were also a place where people went to socialize, relax, and escape the harsh realities of life on the frontier. Some saloons had gambling tables, and some even had prostitutes. But for the most part, they were just a place to relax and enjoy a cold drink. There were different types of saloons. Some were rowdy and some were more refined. But no matter what the atmosphere, the saloon was an important part of life in the Wild West. It was a place to socialize, get news, do business, and most importantly, escape the harsh realities of life on the frontier. In a time when people were constantly battling the elements, disease, and even other people, the saloon provided a much-needed respite. People had to rely on each other for help and support, and they developed close relationships with their neighbors. In many ways, it was a simpler time, but it was also a time of great challenges. People were constantly battling the elements, disease, and even other people. A cowboy might stop by after a long day of herding cattle to unwind and have a drink. A miner might visit on his way back from a long shift in the mines to refresh himself before heading home. Saloons were also a popular spot for cowboys to meet up with their friends and fellow workers. They would share stories of their adventures on the range and swap tips on how to handle different situations. Cowboys spent a lot of time alone, so they cherished the opportunity to socialize with their peers. It was a wild and lawless time, but it was also a time of great opportunity and adventure. If you needed something, you had to get it yourself. Most people were isolated in their own little world, trying to eke out a living from the land. In these circumstances, people became very self-sufficient. They grew their own food, mended their own clothes, and took care of any illnesses themselves. There was no time or money to waste on luxuries like prepackaged foods or store-bought clothing. And medical care was a luxury few could afford. Doctors were in short supply and often had to travel long distances to reach their patients. So people were forced to rely on traditional remedies and homegrown treatments. It was a difficult way to live, but it was also a way that fostered independence, self-reliance, and resilience. People had to be tough and resourceful in order to survive. Building a house was harder when materials were scarce. Even staying healthy was harder when doctors were few and far between. But despite these hardships, the people of the Wild West were incredibly resourceful. They learned to make the most of what they had and to rely on their own ingenuity to solve problems. They developed new technologies and techniques to help them survive and thrive in this harsh environment. And they built strong communities based on mutual support and cooperation. For example, if you were a rancher, your entire livelihood depended on the health and well-being of your cattle. If a disease swept through the herd, it could wipe out everything you had worked for. Or if a wildfire swept across the plains, it could destroy your pastures and force you to sell off your herd at a loss. The same was true for homesteaders. If a drought lasted for years, your crops would fail, and you might be forced to move to a new area in search of more fertile land. Miners also faced dangerous conditions. They worked long hours in cramped, dark spaces, often without proper ventilation or safety equipment. They were constantly at risk of injury or death from cave-ins, explosions, or exposure to toxic materials. So these men and women were truly living on the edge, always aware that their next meal or their very survival might depend on the next turn of events. The first thing to understand is that this was not your typical 9-to-5 workday. Life revolved around your occupation, which most likely had to do with ranching, farming, or mining. Ranchers took their cows where they could graze. They worked long days taking care of the cattle, fixing fences, branding calves, and working other aspects of their ranch. This type of work was seasonal and very dependent on the weather. Homesteaders farmed the land, grew crops, and raised families. Then there were the miners who struck out into the wilderness, searching for gold or other precious metals. They lived rough, isolating themselves from society to carve out a living from the unforgiving landscape. These individuals weren't just working to put food on the table. They were fighting to survive. And this fight for survival shaped every aspect of their lives. They relied on their skills, grit, and determination to overcome the challenges that came their way. And it wasn't just their occupations that made life difficult. Everything was more difficult out west. Life on the frontier was solitary. You were generally responsible for yourself. The isolation also led to a strong sense of community among those who lived out west. Now, this may seem odd to us today, but back then, saloons were an essential part of everyday life for people in the Wild West, in addition to providing a place to socialize. Saloons were also an important source of news and information. Most towns had only one saloon, so it was a central meeting point for everyone in the community. For example, a traveling salesman might stop by the saloon to rest and recuperate before hitting the road again. So what did they actually drink in the Wild West? When you imagine the Wild West, you probably imagine dusty roads, horse-drawn carriages, and maybe even a saloon or two. But it wasn't just physical activity that kept people slim. The lack of weight problems in the Wild West is just one example of how life was different back then. What do you find most interesting about the Wild West? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.